Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Story Facts, where tonight's sleep story drifts gently across the quiet, rust-colored plains of Mars, and where this bedtime story is made not of urgency or noise, but of dust, ice, and the soft memory of ancient rivers that once moved with patient grace beneath a salmon sky. So, as this nighttime story begins, allow your breathing to become easy and unhurried. Allow your shoulders to loosen. Allow the day to dim around you, because there is nothing you need to solve now. Know where you need to go, and nothing required of you except rest. As we travel slowly together toward a peaceful world that turns in sunlight and shadow far from Earth. A world named for brightness and distance, yet filled with such delicate and calming details that it becomes the perfect relaxing story to fall asleep to. And before we wander farther into this serene landscape, take a quiet moment to settle in, feeling the support beneath you, noticing the gentle rise and fall of your breath, as if each inhale were a tide arriving at a silent shore, and each exhale were that tide softly drawing back again, leaving smooth sand behind. And with each breath, imagine that the air around you is a little cooler, a little softer, a little calmer, until your thoughts begin to spread out like fine red dust under a peaceful sky. And the voice of this calming narration becomes a lantern glowing low and warm beside you, guiding you toward deep sleep with no effort at all. Now picture Mars at dusk, not as a harsh and distant planet, but as a quiet companion in the dark, its horizon wide and level, its deserts open and still, its atmosphere thin and faintly golden with the last trace of day, while above the land, small winds move so gently across the surface that they lift only the finest grains, whispering over plains of iron-rich dust that give Mars its soft red color, as though the planet had been painted with powdered clay and sunset combined. And it is lovely to remember in this gentle bedtime that the dust of Mars is more than dust alone, for it carries within it tiny clues about the planet's chemistry, minerals, and history, each grain like a sleeping fragment of time, resting where ancient forces placed it, sometimes gathered into dunes, sometimes spread into endless sheets, and sometimes carried into the pale sky by devils of wind that turn slowly over the empty ground like dancers practicing in silence. Never hurried, never loud, simply tracing circles and then fading away. And beneath that dust, in some regions, there is ice, quiet and hidden, tucked into the soil and layered into the poles, where Mars keeps its frozen reserves of water and carbon dioxide like sealed letters from another age. And this is one of the most soothing facts about the red planet, that even in a place so dry and still, water has not vanished entirely, but lingers there in crystal forms, sleeping below the surface, bright and ancient and cold, waiting under the dust with the patience of geology. And farther north and south, the polar caps stretch in pale expanses, growing and shrinking with the seasons, breathing in their own slow planetary rhythm, so that Mars, too, seems to inhale and exhale over the course of its long year, frosting itself in winter, softening in spring, and holding within that immense cycle a kind of celestial calm that feels almost tender. And perhaps most comforting of all are the old river valleys, because across Mars there are winding channels, fans, deltas, and carved landscapes that suggest that long ago liquid water once moved there, not in a sudden roar for our purposes tonight, but in an imagined hush, in a steady and graceful passage through stone, shaping the land one curve at a time, leaving behind dry beds and branching patterns still visible from orbit, as though the planet remembers every stream that touched it. So while you rest, you may picture one of those ancient rivers under a dim young sun, sliding around stones, gathering in basins, and moving onward through craters and plains, until eventually the water is gone, and only the shape of its journey remains, preserved in the quiet rock like a lullaby written in the language of erosion. And as our gentle bedtime journey continues, let your mind float above Valles Marineris, the vast canyon system of Mars, not as a place of drama, but as a place of scale and stillness, where cliffs descend into layered darkness and old sediments rest in bands of rust, umber, and rose, each layer a page in a very slow story, each wall an archive of wind, frost, and passing ages, so broad and tranquil that even immensity begins to feel comforting. And somewhere below, across ancient lakebeds and mineral-rich ground, rovers have moved carefully and patiently, finding evidence of clays and salts, those subtle signatures that whisper of water's long companionship with Martian soil. And the thought itself is soothing, that on a world now so hushed, there were once wet seasons, shorelines, perhaps even gentle ripples under a fading light. And now, as your body grows heavier and your thoughts grow softer, let Mars become simpler again, just a quiet sphere turning in the dark, wrapped in thin air, dusted in iron-red powder, crowned with ice and marked with the sleeping paths of vanished rivers. While this sleep story carries you onward with no need to hold every fact too tightly, because the facts are here only as lanterns in the dusk, small peaceful lights in a vast calm landscape, and your only task is to drift beside them, listening, loosening, and letting the red silence of evening Mars guide you slowly, steadily, and sweetly toward rest, toward stillness, and toward deep sleep. Now, as this sleep story continues, let yourself drift a little farther over the peaceful face of Mars, moving away from the broad red plains and toward the pale stillness of the polar regions, where the planet seems to soften into silence, and where one of the most calming facts of all waits beneath layers of frost and dust. Because Mars, though dry and distant now, still keeps great stores of ice at its poles and hidden in its ground, as if the world itself had folded cool blankets over its oldest memories and chosen to rest. And in this bedtime story, there is no need to hurry toward those frozen places, because the approach itself is part of the gentle bedtime, the long glide over land touched by twilight, the thin air lying lightly over crater rims and open flats, the red surface slowly paling as you near the north, where the ice cap spreads out like a sheet of moonlit silk, delicate and bright against the rust-colored world around it. And if you listen closely in the quiet way of imagination, you may sense that Mars has seasons of its own, not busy or noisy seasons, but patient, elegant shifts of cold and light, so that in winter the poles gather more frost, adding soft layers of frozen carbon dioxide. And in warmer times, some of that frost retreats again, returning to the atmosphere in a slow, almost breathing rhythm, as if the planet were taking the gentlest inhale and exhale over the course of its long year. And that rhythm is so comforting to think about tonight, because even on a world that seems still, there is movement. But it is the kind of movement that never disturbs rest, the kind that happens quietly in the background, like curtains settling after a breeze, or snow melting from a roof under a pale morning sun beneath the visible frost. There is also water ice, stored in sheets and layers and buried places. And this fact can rest beside you like a cool stone in the hand, simple and reassuring, because it means Mars is not only a planet of dust, but also a planet of hidden reservoirs, of frozen archives, of white brightness tucked under red soil, where time has rested for millions of years without complaint. And in some regions, the ground itself holds this ice just below the surface, protected from the open sky, so that if you imagine the Martian soil tonight, you can picture it as a quilt of fine red grains spread over ancient cold, a covering over clear crystals, dust above frost, warmth above stillness, layer above layer, all of it composed with such quiet patience that the entire landscape feels less like a barren wilderness and more like a sleeping library of climates long gone. And there are places on Mars where the land suggests that glaciers once moved, not with force for us tonight, but with calm persistence, flowing so slowly that a human lifetime would hardly notice their passage, shaping valleys and leaving behind gentle traces that remain even after the ice itself has faded or withdrawn. And this is another soothing thought to carry into deep sleep, that some of the grandest changes in the universe happen softly, almost invisibly, one careful moment at a time. And as this relaxing story moves onward, picture those old Martian glaciers as broad ribbons of pale blue-white under a quieter ancient sky, sliding around hills, filling shallow basins, lingering in shadowed places, then gradually becoming buried beneath dust, preserved in stillness as though sleep itself had settled over them. And perhaps that is why Mars feels so suited to calming narration, because nearly every feature on its surface seems to invite a slower way of seeing, a gentler pace of thought, from the frost-bright poles to the canyon walls and dry riverbeds. All of it asking you not to analyze too sharply now, but simply to notice, to float, to let each fact arrive softly, and then drift onward like a feather in low gravity. And speaking of gravity, Mars holds you less tightly than Earth does. And though you remain safely where you are, wrapped in your own night, you can imagine your thoughts becoming lighter here, your burdens weighing less, your mind stepping more softly across the planet's cold ground, each footfall barely sinking into the dust, each breath turning into a small silver cloud of imagination before vanishing into the calm. And overhead, the sky deepens into a dusky violet brown, and perhaps a faint moon passes quietly above, while below, the land remains almost motionless, except for the possibility of a distant whisper of wind, brushing over ridges of frost and smoothing the fine dust between shallow undulations, never breaking the peace, only refining it, like a careful hand flattening a bedsheet before sleep. And one of the loveliest facts of all is that Mars preserves so much of its history at the surface, because without active oceans and heavy rain to erase its marks, old features can remain for extraordinary spans of time. And so the polar layers, the icy sediments, and the traces of ancient climate can lie there quietly, page upon page, waiting in silence, as if the planet had written itself a very slow diary and then closed the cover for the night. And now, as the nighttime story lowers its voice even more, let your mind settle on a single image: the pale edge of the Martian ice cap glowing faintly in the dark, the red land beside it cool and still, and beneath both of them, ancient frozen water resting in patient secrecy, while above, the stars remain steady and distant and kind. And all the science of this faraway world becomes simple enough to cradle you, because tonight Mars is not a puzzle to solve, but a place to rest beside, a cold and beautiful companion whose dust, ice, and buried rivers seem to whisper the oldest and gentlest invitation of all, that it is safe now to soften, safe now to grow heavy, safe now to drift, and safe at last to fall asleep. And now, as this sleep story glides onward through the calm red night of Mars, let yourself drift away from the bright stillness of the polar frost and toward the older landscapes where the planet keeps some of its gentlest secrets. For there are places on Mars where the ground still carries the graceful shapes of vanished water, long curving valleys, branching channels, quiet deltas, and broad fan-like deposits that rest upon the land like memories pressed softly into stone. And in this bedtime story, those ancient rivers do not rush or roar, but move only in the imagination with a slow and silver patience, as though the planet is remembering them in a dream. And if you picture the surface below, you may see that it is not one single kind of desert, but a vast and varied tapestry, with crater rims fading into plains, low ridges dissolving into open basins, and long empty stretches where once, perhaps for a season or many seasons, water traced its careful path through dust and sediment, turning gently around obstacles, gathering in hollows and sinking into the soil with the kind of quiet devotion that only time understands. And this may be one of the most relaxing facts about Mars to fall asleep to, that a world now known for dryness once held flowing water in many places, leaving behind patterns so clear that even now, from high above, they appear like sleeping branches spread across the planet's skin, delicate and patient and undisturbed. And as this nighttime story settles more deeply into calm, imagine that you are floating over one of those old valley networks at dusk, not close enough to disturb the land, only near enough to appreciate its softness, the shallow curves where water once wandered, the darker sediments resting low in the ancient channels, the fine red dust that later arrived and laid itself over everything like a blanket, not erasing the old riverbeds, only softening their edges, the way memory softens the sharpness of a distant day. And perhaps somewhere nearby, there is an open basin that was once a lake, a place where water may have lingered beneath a pale sky, smooth and reflective and still, while sediments drifted slowly down to the bottom in thin layers, making quiet records of passing years. And this too is soothing to imagine tonight, because lakebeds are not hurried places, and even in their ancient Martian form, they invite a gentler pace, a slower thought, a deeper breath. And in some of these regions, minerals formed that only make sense in the presence of water, clays and salts, and other subtle traces that speak in the calm language of chemistry, reminding us that Mars was not always as cold and dry as it seems now, but changed over vast ages, letting water appear, move, settle, freeze, vanish, and leave its signature behind in rock so patiently that millions upon millions of years later, the story can still be read in silence. And tonight, though, you need not read it closely, because this is a relaxing story, not a lesson to memorize. And every fact is here only to reassure you that the universe can be slow and beautiful and full of quiet continuity, even on a faraway world of rust-colored plains. And as your breathing becomes steadier, let your thoughts wander toward a Martian delta, where an old river once met a standing body of water and spread itself outward in branching forms, laying down fine grains of sediment in elegant fans, one layer after another, each softer than the one before, until the whole structure became a resting place for time itself, preserved beneath later dust, waiting with endless patience in the hush of geological sleep. And there is something deeply comforting about that idea, that even after the water disappeared, the shape of its gentleness remained. That movement could fade while form endured, that the river's voice could fall silent while its pathway stayed visible under the long watch of stars. And now imagine the air above these ancient channels, thin and cool and touched by twilight, with only the faintest drift of dust moving across the land, smoothing the surface grain by grain, never in a hurry, never with force, just enough to make the world seem even quieter, as if Mars itself were settling into bed beneath a blanket of red silk. And overhead, the sky darkens into deeper shades, and perhaps tiny points of starlight begin to appear, while below the old river valleys rest in shadow, their winding courses still legible across the landscape, like lines from a lullaby written long ago. And because Mars has lower gravity than Earth, the whole imagined journey feels lighter somehow, as if your thoughts can glide instead of step, drift instead of press. And in that gentle lightness, the science becomes a kind of cradle, carrying you through facts about dust, ice, and ancient rivers, without asking anything from you except surrender to the rhythm. And so let the riverbeds below become simpler now, not as maps or data, but as soft pathways across a sleeping planet, pathways made by water long ago and kept safe by time, while this calming narration lowers itself to a softer and softer tone, and the red world turns quietly beneath you, holding its dry deltas, its buried minerals, its remembered lakes, and its winding channels in a stillness so complete that your own body may begin to copy it, growing heavier, quieter, and more at ease. Until this sleep story, this gentle bedtime drift over the ancient waters of Mars, carries you a little farther from wakefulness, a little deeper into rest, and a little nearer to that tender, floating place where thoughts loosen, breathing slows, and deep sleep arrives like a soft river returning home. As this sleep story continues across the restful face of Mars, let yourself drift onward from the ancient riverbeds and into a quieter region where the land opens into vast and gentle depth, where the ground seems to have exhaled over ages and left behind long walls, soft slopes, and layered silence, and where this bedtime story becomes even slower, even softer, as though the whole red planet were turning down its voice for the sake of your rest. And now, in the deepening Martian night, imagine that you are floating above a broad canyon landscape, not with any rush or effort, but with the ease of a feather carried through still air, moving low enough to notice the subtle bands of color in the rock, and high enough to feel the immense calm of distance, while below you the terrain unfolds in dusky shades of rust, rose, amber, and brown, each layer resting upon another, like folded blankets, laid down one patient evening at a time. And there is something especially soothing about layered stone, because it does not ask to be understood all at once. It simply allows itself to be seen slowly, one band after another, one softened edge after another, as if time itself had chosen to settle here and remain visible. And in this relaxing story to fall asleep to, that patient visibility becomes a comfort, a reminder that even great changes can happen gently, without noise, without strain, without any need to hurry. And so let your breathing follow the shape of the canyon beneath you, long and unbroken, a smooth inward drift and a slower outward release, while your thoughts begin to mirror the terrain, stretching wide, becoming less crowded, less urgent, more open, until every small worry seems to fade into the broader red stillness and become just another grain of dust resting quietly on an ancient ledge. And perhaps somewhere along these canyon walls, there are traces of old sediments placed by water long ago, or patterns shaped by frost and wind in ages so slow that they feel almost outside time. And this is part of the beauty of Mars at night, that so much of its history seems to sleep in plain sight, preserved not in motion, but in form, not in sound, but in silence, not in explanation, but in the calm arrangement of land and shadow. And as this nighttime story moves gently onward, imagine the canyon floor below as a wide ribbon of darkness touched by faint reflected light, smooth in some places, gently broken in others, with dunes lying in quiet curves, as if the wind had passed by long ago, and then chosen not to return for a while, leaving the surface perfectly content in its stillness. And above those dunes, the cliff faces rise in soft tiers, not severe for us tonight, but protective, sheltering, like the walls of a vast and peaceful room. And between them, the air feels even more hushed, as though the whole landscape were holding a tender pause for you, inviting your mind to loosen and your body to grow pleasantly heavy. And this is where the calming narration grows softer still, because the deeper we move into the canyon of Mars, the more the world seems arranged for gentle bedtime, for quiet observation, for the kind of drifting attention that does not cling to details, but lets them pass in a slow procession, one after another, like lanterns floating down a dark and silent river. And perhaps you notice a pale patch of frost gathered in a shadowed place where sunlight seldom lingers, or a faint slope where dust has settled in fine, delicate layers. And each small feature seems to say the same thing in its own language. Rest now, slow now, soften now. Because nothing here is demanding, and nothing here is loud. Only stone, dust, cold air, and the hush of a distant world turning steadily under stars. And if this gentle bedtime has brought you far from waking thought, then simply continue floating, because there is no need to keep track of where one cliff ends and another begins. No need to count the layers or name the ridges, only a need to feel the softness of the scene, the immense calm of a planet that has known long winters and quiet epochs, and the subtle touch of vanished water, and has kept all of it with a patience so complete that even the imagination begins to slow in its presence. And now the canyon widens again, opening into a broad basin where the floor appears smoother and the darkness deeper. And your mind may settle there as easily as dust settling after the gentlest breeze, each thought descending, each worry lying down, each remaining spark of wakefulness dimming into a low and harmless glow, while the red walls around you seem to recede into velvety shadow, and the sky above remains thin and dark and full of stillness. And because this is a sleep story made to help you fall asleep, every image may now become softer than before, the rock less sharp, the shadows more tender, the distance more forgiving, until Mars itself feels less like a planet and more like a cradle of quiet geology, holding canyons, sediments, frost, and dust in one slow embrace. And in that embrace, your breathing finds an easy rhythm, your body finds a deeper comfort, and your thoughts begin to drift beyond words altogether, leaving only the sense of floating through a cool and ancient place where time does not press, where nothing rushes, and where deep sleep can arrive the same way Martian dust settles over stone, softly, gradually, and without a sound. Now, as this sleep story carries you farther into the quiet heart of Mars, let yourself move out from the shelter of the canyon and onto a wide open plain where the land stretches so softly into the distance that it becomes difficult to tell where the ground ends and the dark sky begins. And in that peaceful uncertainty, there is something deeply comforting, because this bedtime story is not asking you to measure or compare or decide, only to drift and notice and rest while the great red planet keeps turning beneath you with a patience so old and so complete that even your thoughts begin to settle into its rhythm. And here, on this silent Martian plain, one of the most relaxing facts of all waits in the smallest details. For the dust of Mars, so fine and light and iron-rich, covers enormous regions of the world in a soft reddish veil, tinting the ground with tones of rust, clay, rose, and amber, until the whole landscape seems wrapped in the dim glow of an endless sunset. And tonight, in this gentle bedtime, that dust is not something harsh or restless, but something almost velvety, something that lies over rock and ridge and ancient sediment like a hush made visible, filling shallow hollows, smoothing edges, muting sharpness, and giving the planet its tender, drowsy appearance, as though Mars itself had been carefully tucked beneath a warm blanket of powdered color. And if you imagine descending just a little lower, still floating with perfect ease and no effort at all, you may begin to notice how the dust gathers in gentle drifts against stones and low rises, how it traces the contours of the land with delicate care, how it softens craters and plains the same way fresh snow softens a familiar garden, making every shape quieter, every boundary less severe, every surface more forgiving to the eye and to the mind. And sometimes, on Mars, the winds rise just enough to lift this fine material into motion, creating small dust devils that wander across the open ground in graceful spirals. And for this relaxing story to fall asleep to, you can picture them not as dramatic towers, but as slow, patient dancers moving over the plain with almost ceremonial calm, turning once or twice through the thin air, drawing light lines over the surface, and then dissolving again, leaving only a faint trace behind, as if the planet had sighed in its sleep, and then become still once more. And this is another soothing truth about Mars, that even its motion often feels delicate, that a world can be active without becoming loud, and that the softest winds on a distant planet can redraw the skin of the land grain by grain, never hurrying, never straining, only continuing their quiet work over years and centuries, and ages too broad to fully hold in waking thought. And because the atmosphere here is so thin, every movement of dust feels even more precious, as though each grain has taken part in a very old and very gentle conversation between land and air, rising for a moment, traveling lightly, and then returning to rest. And perhaps that is why the plains below seem so calm tonight, because they are made of countless tiny journeys already completed, countless particles already settled, countless motions already finished and folded into stillness. And as your breathing grows slower, you may picture those plains extending outward in all directions, broken only by low ridges, distant crater rims, and occasional dunes shaped into smooth curves by winds that have long since passed, while above them hangs a dark sky so spacious and serene that it seems to remove all pressure from the mind, making room for softness, making room for silence, making room for sleep. And perhaps somewhere beneath the dust there is buried ice, sleeping quietly under the surface where sunlight cannot easily reach it, or an old layer of sediment once laid down when water still moved across the world. And this makes the plain feel even gentler, because what seems empty is not empty at all, but full of hidden memory, full of preserved time, full of secret coolness and ancient change, resting quietly under the red. And in this nighttime story, that hiddenness is a comfort, a reminder that not everything peaceful must be visible, that some of the most beautiful parts of a world remain tucked away beneath the surface, held in calm reserve, like dreams that have not yet fully formed. And now imagine that the plain is touched by the faintest edge of starlight, enough to reveal a low shimmer over the dust, enough to make the land appear almost silky, while far away one small dust devil turns once on the horizon and then vanishes, and the entire scene returns to perfect stillness, so complete that your own body may begin to imitate it, your muscles loosening, your jaw softening, your hands becoming warm and heavy, your thoughts no longer marching, but drifting, drifting the way Martian dust drifts over stone. And because this sleep story is meant to guide you gently toward deep sleep, let every detail now become slower and softer. The plain wider, the sky darker, the dust finer, the silence deeper, until the science itself feels like a lullaby, telling you that Mars is a world of patient surfaces, hidden ice, ancient traces, and delicate winds. A world where even movement soon becomes rest, and where every grain of red dust seems to know how to settle and so remain here a little longer, floating above the sleeping plain, listening to the calm narration of a planet that has spent ages learning stillness. And let that stillness enter you now, quietly and completely, until the red horizon fades, the last wandering thought disappears like dust in thin evening air, and you sink very softly and very safely toward sleep. And now, as this sleep story continues across the hush of the Martian night, let yourself drift even lower over the quiet plain, where the red dust lies smooth and undisturbed, and where the land, at first glance, seems simple, almost empty, but where some of the most soothing science waits in secret beneath the surface. Because Mars is not only a world of visible deserts and ancient dry riverbeds, but also a world that quietly keeps stores of ice hidden below its skin. And in this bedtime story, that hiddenness feels gentle rather than mysterious, like a cool pillow beneath a warm blanket, like a calm truth resting under softer thoughts. And if you imagine the ground below as a layered place, dust over soil, soil over frost, frost over older sediments, then the whole planet begins to feel less barren and more tender, as though its red plains were carefully covering delicate reservoirs of stillness, preserving them through seasons, through long years, through ages of thin sunlight and slower cold. And this may be one of the most relaxing facts about Mars to fall asleep to tonight, that under broad stretches of dusty ground, there can be water ice resting in silence, held in place by the planet's chill and by the gentle protection of the layers above it, so that even now, on a world that seems dry from afar, traces of ancient water remain, quiet and patient and beautifully unchanged. And as this nighttime story carries you onward, picture that buried ice not as something harsh or glittering, but as something soft in the imagination, pale and peaceful under the red, smooth as folded silk, cool as shaded stone, and so calm in its long stillness that the very idea of it seems to slow your breathing. And perhaps above these hidden layers, the plain appears almost endless, with low ripples of dust, faint ridges, and the occasional shallow hollow where old winds once paused. And everything is arranged with such delicate balance that the science itself becomes a kind of cradle holding facts about climate and geology in the gentlest possible way, asking nothing from you except that you float, listen, and rest. And on Mars, the cycle of cold and warmth is subtle but real, and over immense spans of time, the planet has gathered, lost, shifted, and preserved ice in different places, so that the ground becomes a quiet archive of changing climates, each buried layer like a page tucked carefully beneath another. And tonight, there is no need to read those pages closely, because this relaxing story is not here to wake the mind, only to ease it, to let each scientific image pass through you like a soft, current moving through calm water, and so imagine that somewhere beneath the dust below you, a shallow sheet of ancient ice lies sleeping, covered and protected, untouched by any noise. While above it, the plain remains cool and dim under starlight, and the whole scene takes on the stillness of a room where everyone has already gone to bed. And the more you rest with this image, the more Mars begins to feel like a planet made for calming narration, a place where the great subjects of dust, ice, and ancient rivers are all connected by patience. Because the rivers may have once flowed across the surface, the water may have later frozen or retreated, and the dust may have come afterward to cover the traces in soft red layers until the whole history of the world became tucked in and quieted, not erased, only lulled into sleep. And there is something deeply comforting in that sequence. That movement can become memory. That memory can become preservation. And that preservation can rest beneath a tranquil plain for millions of years without losing its place in the story. And now, in this gentle bedtime drift, let your attention move with exquisite slowness across the ground, noticing how the faint contours of the surface seem almost cushioned by dust, how old impacts and subtle slopes have been softened, how even the hidden ice below seems to lend the planet an inward coolness, a steady calm that rises gently through the red soil and meets the night. And because Mars has always invited us to imagine both what is seen and what is concealed, this chapter of our bedtime story becomes quieter with every sentence, more spacious with every breath. And perhaps your own thoughts are now doing what Martian water once did, flowing more slowly, spreading more gently, settling into lower and calmer places. And if a last small worry appears, let it sink beneath the dust like a stone lowered into soft sand, covered over with care, held without effort, while above it, the surface grows smooth again, untroubled and serene, and above the plain, the stars remain fixed and kind, while below, the hidden ice sleeps on in darkness, so complete and peaceful that it almost seems to radiate calm back into the night. And this is the feeling to carry now as you begin to fall asleep. The feeling that beneath everything restless there may be something quieter. Beneath every dry surface, something cool and preserved. Beneath every waking thought, a deeper and gentler stillness waiting to receive you. And so let the red ground of Mars stretch on without end. Let the buried frost remain safe beneath it. Let the memory of water rest untroubled in the layers below, and let this sleep story lower its voice until it becomes almost indistinguishable from your own slow breathing, guiding you toward deep sleep with the softness of dust settling, the patience of ice enduring, and the peaceful certainty that even on a distant planet, the most beautiful things are sometimes the ones that remain hidden, quiet, and still. And now, as this sleep story continues in its slow and gentle orbit of thought, let yourself drift toward one of the loveliest places in the Martian imagination, a place where land and memory seem to rest together in perfect stillness, where an ancient delta lies preserved like a soft imprint of flowing time, and where this bedtime story becomes calmer still, because a delta is such a peaceful shape to consider at night, made by water that once arrived patiently spread itself delicately and laid down fine sediments in broad, branching fans, as though the planet were practicing the art of exhaling into rest. And as you float above this old Martian basin, you do not need to think of it as a site of investigation or effort, only as a quiet cradle in the red world, a shallow bowl of land that may once have held a lake, receiving the slow work of water under a sky far older than memory, while grain by grain, layer by layer, silt and sand settled into place with a tenderness so complete that even now, after ages beyond counting, their arrangement still whispers of calm motion and gentle arrival. And in this relaxing story to fall asleep to, the delta below becomes a kind of lullaby written in shape rather than sound, with channels branching and softening as they spread into the basin, as if ancient rivers had loosened their grip and allowed themselves to rest at last, no longer cutting, no longer hurrying, only opening outward and placing their burden down into quiet water. And perhaps that is one of the most soothing science facts about Mars, that the planet still carries these elegant signs of long vanished water, not in a dramatic way for tonight, but in a restful one, in the curved geometry of old shorelines, in layered sediments lying with extraordinary patience, in minerals and textures that hint that water once lingered here long enough to shape, to sort, to settle, and then, eventually, to leave behind its memory with remarkable grace. And so, as this nighttime story deepens, picture the ancient lake not as a stormy body or a troubled one, but as a still and reflective surface under dim light, holding the sky in silence, while faint streams entered from higher ground, each stream carrying tiny grains that drifted downward through calm water and came to rest on the bottom in soft blankets, making a quiet archive of seasons, cycles, and gentle change. And over time, those sediments remained, tucked safely into the basin. And even after the water itself disappeared, the delta endured, a sleeping form upon the landscape, protected by the vast, dry patience of Mars. And it is deeply comforting to imagine that on a world now so silent, the shape of calm water has not been forgotten, that the land still remembers how stillness once gathered in pools and along shorelines, and that those memories are written not in noise, but in layers. And now let your own thoughts begin to imitate those layers, one settling softly over the next, not disappearing exactly, but becoming smoother, quieter, less urgent, as if your waking mind were turning into a calm, sedimentary plain, where every thought can find a gentle resting place. Every concern can drift down and lie undisturbed, and every small tension can spread thinly until it becomes part of the soft terrain of sleep. And above the ancient delta, the Martian night feels spacious and weightless, the sky dark and clear, the horizon wide and low. And below you, the old branching channels seem almost like veins of calm passing through the land, each one a path once taken by water, each one now filled not with current, but with silence. And that silence is so complete, so patient, so kind, that it seems to invite your breathing to slow a little more, your limbs to soften a little more, and your thoughts to drift a little farther from the shore of wakefulness. And perhaps there is fine dust resting across the delta now, dust that arrived much later and covered the old sediments with a reddish veil, not erasing what came before, only dimming it gently, the way twilight dims a garden without taking it away. And beneath that dust the delta remains, composed and serene, keeping its ancient branches, its delicate fan, its memory of water entering stillness while the whole basin sleeps under the long watch of stars. And because Mars is a world where change often happens across immense spans of time, this place feels especially suited to gentle bedtime. For here the story of movement ends in rest, the story of flow ends in settling, and the story of a river ends in a quiet spread of fine material that becomes part of the planet forever. And there is something profoundly restful in that sequence, something that reassures the mind that not every journey must end in effort, that some journeys end in soft arrival, in widening, in release, and so remain above this sleeping delta for a little while longer, floating low in the cool darkness, watching nothing move, hearing nothing ask for your attention, feeling only the calm certainty of land shaped long ago by patient water and preserved by a world that knows how to keep stillness safe. And let that stillness pass into you now as naturally as sediment settling through an ancient lake until your breathing is slower than before, your body heavier than before. And this sleep story becomes little more than a warm, distant murmur over a red basin, where everything that once flowed has already found its place to rest, and where you too may now gently, quietly, and completely begin to fall asleep as this sleep story continues across the serene and sleeping face of Mars. Let yourself drift away from the ancient delta and into a quieter stretch of terrain where the light feels dimmer, the air feels thinner, and the ground below seems to hold its secrets more closely. Because on this peaceful world, there are places where ice may linger, not only in the bright polar caps or beneath broad open plains, but also in shadowed slopes, sheltered layers, and cold hidden spaces. And in this bedtime story, that hidden ice becomes another gentle reminder that Mars is a planet of quiet preservation, a world that keeps cool memories tucked beneath its red skin with extraordinary patience. And now, as your breathing grows slower and more even, imagine that you are floating above a region of softly rolling land where shallow hollows and modest ridges receive almost no direct warmth, where dust has settled in fine and delicate sheets, and where beneath that dust the ground may hold a pale reserve of frozen water, resting in darkness with no need to move, no need to melt, no need to become anything other than what it already is, still and calm and beautifully enduring. And perhaps this is one of the loveliest facts of all to fall asleep to tonight, that on Mars the relationship between dust and ice is not one of conflict, but of shelter, because the dust can act almost like a blanket, protecting colder material below from the full reach of sunlight. And so the surface becomes a layered hush, warm red grains above, quiet frost below, each keeping company with the other in a balance so delicate and slow that it feels more like a lullaby than a scientific process. And in this relaxing story, you do not need to picture the ice sharply, only softly, as a faint blue-white stillness beneath reddish soil a silent coolness under a muted plane, as though the planet had hidden away small pieces of winter and then forgotten to retrieve them. And overhead, the sky remains vast and dark, touched by distant stars, while below the land seems nearly motionless, except for the imagined trace of a breeze moving over the surface so lightly that it disturbs only the finest dust, smoothing it across the ground in wisps and ribbons, never breaking the peace, only deepening it, until the whole landscape resembles a room arranged carefully for rest. And because this nighttime story is meant to guide you gently toward deep sleep, let the science arrive in the gentlest possible way, not as a lesson, but as a series of calm images: hidden ice beneath dust, colder slopes turned away from the sun, thin air barely stirring, ancient climates leaving faint and beautiful signatures in the ground, all of it suggesting that Mars has spent immense stretches of time learning how to become quieter and quieter. And maybe long ago, some of these colder places received moisture from a different Martian age, an age when the climate shifted, when frost gathered more easily, when snow or ice may have settled in selected regions, and then remained protected by shadow or by later layers of sediment. And that possibility feels restful tonight, because it reminds the mind that not all history vanishes. Some of it stays close to the surface, sleeping lightly beneath the dust, and waiting without expectation. And as you float lower still, always gently and without effort, the texture of the ground becomes softer in your imagination, the fine red cover appearing almost like powdered velvet laid over stone. And beneath that velvet, the hidden ice seems to lend the whole place an inward coolness, a steadiness, a calm reserve that reaches upward into the night and meets your own slowing thoughts. And perhaps this is why Mars makes such a perfect setting for a calming narration, because even its unseen features feel peaceful. Even what lies beneath the ground seems arranged for quiet, and even the absence of visible water becomes gentle when you remember that the planet still keeps frozen traces of it in silence. And now let your mind rest on a simple image: a low red hillside under starlight, its surface smooth with dust, its underside cool with ancient ice, its shadows long and tender, and everything about it composed at a pace so slow that the passing of centuries would seem like little more than a long exhale. And in that image, your own thoughts may begin to settle the way Martian dust settles, one by one, each thought landing lightly, each concern losing its edge, each fragment of wakefulness becoming covered by something softer and quieter, until the whole inner landscape begins to resemble the one below, layered, hushed, and at peace. And because this is a gentle bedtime journey, every detail can now grow dimmer and kinder, the ridges lower, the shadows deeper, the dust finer, the hidden ice cooler and more distant, all of it drawing you away from the busy brightness of the day and toward the calm interior of the night. And somewhere in that stillness, between the red ground and the frozen memory beneath it, Mars seems to offer the oldest comfort of all, that rest does not always require emptiness, only softness, only patience, only a place where what is delicate may remain undisturbed. And so this sleep story carries you onward through the shadowed ground of a faraway planet, where dust protects ice, silence protects memory, and the whole world seems to whisper in the quietest possible voice that it is safe now to loosen, safe now to drift, and safe now, at last, to fall asleep. And now, as this sleep story continues through the deep and velvety quiet of Mars, let yourself drift gently onward from the shadowed ground and buried ice into a broad and peaceful crater basin, a place so still and softly shaped that it feels almost like a bowl made for rest, as though the planet itself had formed one perfect hollow in which silence could gather and remain undisturbed for ages beyond counting. And in this bedtime story, you do not arrive with any sound at all, only with the easy feeling of floating lower through calm night air, until the rounded rim of the crater opens beneath you and the land inside appears smooth, patient, and waiting. And perhaps that is one of the loveliest ways to think of Mars tonight, not as a world of harshness, but as a world of collected stillness, where dust settles, frost lingers, old water leaves its memory behind, and even the impact-marked basins of the planet eventually become gentle places, softened by time, softened by wind, softened by the fine red veil that lies over so much of the surface, like a blanket drawn carefully over a sleeping form. And now, as your breathing becomes quieter and more even, picture the inside of this crater as a resting place for many layers of calm. The floor touched with smooth sediment, the low slopes feathered with dust, the rim holding the darkness like a protective hand, and everywhere a softness that has taken millions of years to compose itself, grain by grain, shadow by shadow, until the whole basin feels less like a scar in the landscape and more like a cradle left open beneath the stars. And if water once visited places like this, gathering briefly or lingering for longer under another sky and in another age, then perhaps some of the sediments below carry that quiet history within them, not loudly, not urgently, but with the patience of layers resting one upon another, each one settled in stillness, each one preserving a moment of ancient change. And for tonight, that thought can be deeply comforting because it reminds the mind that even motion can leave behind peace. Even flow can end in rest. Even a river's last arrival can become the beginning of a long and tranquil sleep in stone. And so, in this relaxing story to fall asleep to, let yourself hover above the basin and imagine the old crater floor under faint starlight, where dust has drifted into shallow folds and the land seems almost brushed smooth by time, while around you the thin Martian air holds no demand, no interruption, only space, only hush, only the quiet companionship of a distant world turning slowly in darkness. And perhaps along one side of the basin there are subtle fans of sediment where water may once have entered, laying down fine materials in calm, spreading patterns. And though nothing moves there now, the shapes remain with extraordinary grace, like the last notes of a lullaby lingering after the song itself has faded. And this is one of the most soothing things about Mars, that it remembers through form, through texture, through long-preserved arrangement, letting its history become part of the night without ever disturbing the silence. And now let that idea settle into you. That memory does not always need words. that a place may remember simply by holding its shape, simply by remaining, simply by resting long enough for time to become tenderness. And as you rest with that thought, your own mind may begin to smooth out as well. Your thoughts no longer sharp or crowded, but gently spaced, like low ridges around a quiet basin, each one softened by distance and shadow. And because this is a gentle bedtime journey, nothing here needs to be examined too closely, and every detail may remain slightly blurred in the most peaceful way. The crater rim a dark curve against the sky, the floor below a soft plain of dust and old sediment, the hidden possibility of ancient ice or vanished water tucked into the story of the ground. All of it offering calm rather than complexity, all of it turning science into a kind of moonlit stillness for the mind. And perhaps, somewhere on the inner slope, a faint frost once formed in colder hours and then retreated. Or perhaps, beneath the dust, there is a preserved coolness left from a different climate. But even these possibilities feel restful here, because the basin receives them quietly, keeps them quietly, and lets them belong to the long sleep of the planet. And overhead, the stars remain steady, and below them, the crater seems to hold its breath in the gentlest possible way, not from tension, not from anticipation, but from perfect repose, as if the land itself were listening to the calm narration of its own existence, content with dust, with stone, with buried memory, with the slow passing of seasons too broad for worry and too quiet for fear. And this nighttime story can rest there with it now, in that same wide and silent bowl, where every old layer is settled, every edge is softened, and every trace of ancient motion has already come to stillness. And as you remain above it, your body may begin to follow that example more fully, your shoulders loosening, your jaw unclenching, your hands becoming heavier and warmer, your thoughts descending one by one like fine particles through calm air, until they reach the quiet floor of rest and settle there without effort. And so let the crater remain beneath you as a place where silence learned to rest and never needed to leave, a place where dust covers history with kindness, where possible water once found a peaceful home, where the red world keeps its oldest stories in shapes too soft to disturb sleep, and where you too can now drift lower into calm, lower into warmth, lower into the soft and certain hush of deep sleep, carried not by urgency, but by stillness, not by brightness, but by shadow, and not by effort at all, but by the simple and gentle permission to let go. As this sleep story continues through the deepest and gentlest hours of the Martian night, let yourself drift onward from the quiet crater and toward a broad, ancient lakebed, a place where the land lies so smooth and softly open that it feels almost like a page left blank in the middle of a very old book, waiting only for moonless starlight and the lightest passing wind. And in this bedtime story, there is no urgency in your arrival, only a slow and effortless glide over a level plain where water may once have rested in calm abundance, spreading itself beneath a younger sky, and then, over ages too long to measure in ordinary thought, retreating into memory, leaving behind fine layers of sediment, mineral traces, and a kind of peaceful emptiness that is not lonely at all, but spacious and kind. And perhaps that is one of the most relaxing facts about Mars to fall asleep to tonight. That some of its most beautiful places are landscapes where water is gone but not forgotten, where ancient lakes may have once gathered in silence, holding sediments that settled grain by grain onto the floor below, making soft geological records of stillness. And though the liquid water itself has long since disappeared, the shape of the resting place remains a basin of memory preserved under dust and time. And so, in this nighttime story, picture yourself floating low above that sleeping lakebed, close enough to imagine the subtle textures of the ground, the faint ripples of old deposits, the delicate transitions between dust-covered flats and slightly raised margins where ancient shorelines may once have formed. And everything below you appears so hushed, so undemanding, that the mind begins to loosen simply by observing it. And over this plain, there moves the gentlest whisper of Martian wind, barely enough to lift a trace of fine red dust, barely enough to comb the surface into tender patterns. And because the atmosphere is thin, the whole motion feels especially delicate, as if the air itself were careful not to disturb the long sleep of the land. And in this relaxing story, to guide you toward deep sleep, that wind becomes less a force than a lullaby, something that passes over the world with the same softness as a hand smoothing a blanket. And beneath the dust, there may be older layers rich with clues about Mars, sediments laid down when water stood still here for a time, perhaps long enough for minerals to form and settle, perhaps long enough for the basin to become a quiet collector of the planet's changing climate. And even that science feels peaceful now, because it speaks not of suddenness, but of patience, not of drama, but of accumulation, not of noise, but of small things gently coming to rest. And as your breathing grows slower, imagine those ancient grains descending through calm water long ago, one by one, until the floor of the lake became a soft archive, a place where the red world stored the memory of stillness. And then imagine the water gone, the basin dry, the dust arriving later in warm, rust-colored veils, and the entire scene entering a new age of silence, where nothing more was required, and everything could simply remain. And this is the comfort Mars offers so often in a gentle bedtime like this. That change does not always erase what came before, and that even a vanished lake can continue to cradle the shape of its own quiet existence beneath the stars. And above the plain, the sky is dark and steady, so wide that your thoughts may begin to feel smaller in the most soothing way, not diminished, but relieved of their need to carry so much, while below, the old lakebed stretches outward with such composure that your own body may begin to copy it, your shoulders lowering, your face softening, your hands becoming still, as if every part of you understands that this is a place made for rest. And perhaps somewhere at the edge of the basin, there are low deposits where a stream once entered, or a fan of sediment where an ancient current released what it carried and allowed it to settle. And that idea is deeply calming too, that even movement can end in gentleness. Even journeys can finish in a quiet spreading out. And even rivers, after all their wandering, may find peace by becoming part of a sleeping shore. And now let all those images grow softer, the wind quieter, the lakebed smoother, the red dust finer, the old sediments deeper below, until this calming narration becomes almost weightless itself, floating beside you through the dark, as Mars turns slowly under the stars, carrying its dust, its ice, its dry deltas, its buried water stories, and these silent basins where the memory of still water remains folded into the ground. And because this sleep story is here only to help you fall asleep, there is no need to hold every detail clearly anymore. No need to remember which layer came first or where the basin ends. Only the feeling matters now, the wide and open feeling of a world that knows how to keep stillness safe. The cool and gentle feeling of air moving softly over ancient sediment, the steady and peaceful feeling of drifting over a place where water once rested, and where silence now rests in its place, and so remain above this sleeping Martian lakebed a little longer, listening to the whispering wind pass over dust and memory, letting each breath become slower than the one before, until thought itself begins to settle like fine sediment in calm water, and the entire red planet seems to cradle you in one vast, serene exhale, guiding you gently, patiently, and almost invisibly toward that quiet edge where this bedtime story fades into dream, where this nighttime story becomes only softness, and where deep sleep finally arrives, like a hidden lake returning in silence. And now, as this sleep story continues through the slowest and most peaceful part of the Martian night, let yourself drift onward from the sleeping lakebed toward a low and endless horizon where the land begins to open into a wide plain of soft dust and ancient stone, and where the sky above remains dark, but somehow gentler than before, as though the whole planet is resting in the final deep hush before the faintest hint of morning. And in this bedtime story, that hour feels especially tender, because it is the hour when nothing stirs quickly, when even time seems to loosen its pace, and when Mars, with all its dust, ice, and remembered rivers, seems to exhale into a silence so complete that it can carry you farther and farther from waking thought. And perhaps this is one of the most relaxing facts to fall asleep to tonight, that the surface of Mars, though shaped by immense ages of change, now so often appears still and preserved, holding onto the traces of old climates, old waters, and old winds with extraordinary patience, so that a plain of red dust may also be a page of hidden history, and a quiet horizon may contain within it the memory of frost, the shadow of vanished streams, and the soft persistence of sediment laid down long ago. And as you float low above the ground, the plain below seems almost velvety in its calm. The iron-rich dust spreads so finely across the land that every ridge looks softened, every hollow looks gentler, every line in the terrain looks as though it has been lightly brushed by countless evenings. And it is easy, in such a place, to stop expecting anything at all except peace. And here and there, beneath that dust, the planet may still keep its colder treasures, thin, hidden layers of ice sleeping under the surface, protected from the weak sunlight that will someday return. And it is soothing to imagine those quiet stores of frozen water resting below like cool thoughts beneath a warm blanket, saying nothing, asking nothing, simply remaining, year after year, age after age, in the careful stillness that Mars knows so well. And perhaps far beyond the plain, there are channels once shaped by flowing water, ancient rivers that crossed the land when the world was different, when the climate allowed a softer movement over stone. And though the water itself is gone, the pathways remain like lines from an old lullaby, curving and branching in silence. And tonight, you do not need to follow those lines closely, only to know they are there, sleeping under dust and distance, preserved with a tenderness that turns geology into comfort. And overhead, the stars remain clear and quiet in the thin Martian sky. And because the atmosphere is so delicate, the darkness feels especially pure, as if nothing unnecessary has been allowed to linger within it. And in that spacious darkness, your own thoughts may begin to thin as well, becoming lighter, less crowded, less demanding, until they drift like faint grains over an open plain and come softly to rest. And this is where the calming narration lowers its voice even more, because the red horizon ahead seems to invite a deeper kind of stillness, a wider kind of surrender. And perhaps, if you imagine it gently enough, you can sense the whole planet holding together its dust storms from other seasons, its buried ice, its polar frosts, its crater basins, its layered deltas, its dry lakebeds, and its patient canyon walls, not as separate things now, but as one continuous sleeping landscape, one immense and quiet body of memory lying beneath the stars. And as this nighttime story continues, let yourself become lighter in thought and heavier in body, the perfect balance for sleep, your breath easy, your shoulders low, your hands still, while below you, the plain stretches onward with such composure that even the idea of distance becomes restful. Because on Mars, distance does not always mean effort. Sometimes it means openness, and openness means there is room for every last thought to spread out, lose its edges, and dissolve into calm. And perhaps a whisper of wind moves somewhere far away, too soft to disturb the scene, only enough to stir the finest dust over a stone or to redraw the shallowest ripple in the surface. And even that tiny motion seems part of the lullaby, because Mars does not need great sound or sudden light to tell its story. Only a little red dust, a little ancient ice, a few remembered rivers, and the long patience of the night. And now the horizon grows softer still, not brighter exactly, but more delicate, as though the darkness itself were relaxing. And that subtle change can become your change as well. The last wakeful part of the mind growing dimmer, the last alertness loosening its hold, until every thought begins to settle the way sediment settles through still water, slowly, naturally, without resistance, without effort, simply because rest is where it was always going. And so remain here above the red horizon before dawn, suspended over a world that has mastered the art of quiet preservation. A world where dust blankets old stories, where ice sleeps beneath the ground, where rivers are remembered in stone, and where the broad plain below asks nothing of you except that you follow its example and become still, become soft, become unhurried, until this sleep story is no longer a sequence of words, but only a distant warmth in the dark, a gentle bedtime murmur over a peaceful planet. And at last, even that murmur begins to fade, leaving you in the kindest silence of all. The silence just before dreams. The silence just before deep sleep. The silence of Mars resting beneath the stars. And now, as this sleep story moves into the quietest threshold between night and morning on Mars, let yourself continue drifting over the wide and ancient river plain, where the ground still remembers water in the gentlest possible way. Because this is the hour when the red world seems softer than ever, when the darkness has not fully lifted and the light has not fully arrived, and everything below appears wrapped in a tender gray-red hush, as though the planet itself were pausing between breaths. And in this bedtime story, that pause is a comfort, because nothing is rushing toward the day. Nothing is calling you back to wakefulness, and even the coming light is slow and careful, touching the horizon with such delicacy that it feels less like sunrise and more like a thought that has almost fallen asleep again. And perhaps this is one of the most calming facts to rest with tonight, that Mars has a dawn unlike Earth's, softened by its thin atmosphere, often tinted with dusty color and wide silence, so that the edge of morning spreads over the land, not with noise or sudden brightness, but with a quiet glow that seems perfectly suited to a relaxing story, a gentle bedtime drift, and the slow arrival of deep sleep. And below you, the plain stretches outward in subtle bands and shallow curves, a place where ancient rivers may once have crossed and braided and settled, leaving behind channels, fans, and sediments so old and so patient that they now seem less like traces of movement and more like the sleeping folds of the land itself, softened by dust, preserved by dryness, and held in the same immense stillness that now surrounds you. And as this nighttime story continues, imagine the first pale light brushing the tops of low ridges and shallow banks, revealing the faint texture of the ground without disturbing its rest, while long, cool shadows remain gathered in the old channels, as if the memory of water still prefers the quieter places, the hollows, the protected bends, the places where flow once slowed. And let fine material settle in layers one after another with exquisite patience. And there is something deeply soothing in that image, that even an ancient river knew how to become gentle before it disappeared, knew how to spread into a basin, knew how to leave behind a soft path rather than a sharp one. And in this sleep story, those paths are not clues to be chased, but quiet lines to float above, the kind that ask nothing of the mind except softness and surrender. And perhaps somewhere beneath the red dust, there are cooler pockets where hidden ice still rests, preserved under the surface, keeping a secret tenderness below the waking colors of dawn. And that, too, is comforting, because Mars always seems to hold something quiet beneath what is visible. A buried frost, an old sediment, a lost river course, a patient memory tucked under the soil like a folded blanket beneath a sleeping child. And the more you drift, the more the light grows not brighter exactly, but softer in its own way, revealing the plain as a tapestry of dust, stone, and ancient water-shaped forms, all lying still together without urgency. And perhaps a faint breeze moves over the surface, just enough to stir the finest grains into a silky shimmer, drawing the subtlest patterns across the ground. and then disappearing again, leaving the land even calmer than before. And because this is a calming narration meant to help you fall asleep, every fact can now become less precise and more like a lullaby. Mars, the planet of red dust. Mars, the keeper of hidden ice. Mars, the world of ancient rivers, dry deltas, quiet lakebeds, and soft horizons. Each truth arriving not as information to hold onto, but as something gentle to float beside while the body grows heavier and the mind grows quieter. And overhead, the sky has begun its delicate turning, the stars nearest the horizon fading into the pale wash of morning, while those higher above remain steady a little longer. And this gradual change feels so slow, so kind, that it seems to mirror the way sleep arrives when it is deepest and most natural, not suddenly, but by degrees, with each breath carrying you farther from thought and deeper into calm. And now let the river plain below become simpler and softer still, the channels blending into shadow, the sediments becoming smooth fields of quiet color, the dust lying over everything like a final layer of peace, until Mars itself seems to dissolve into pure restfulness, a cool red silence touched by the first pale light, and still holding all its ancient stories close. And if any thought remains awake in you now, let it settle into one of those old Martian channels, as gently as fine silt settling through calm water, sinking without effort, finding its place without resistance, becoming part of the still landscape instead of moving across it. And so this sleep story continues over the ancient river plain at the edge of Martian dawn, where dust glows softly, where ice sleeps unseen beneath the ground, where rivers are remembered only in shape and shadow, and where the whole planet seems to whisper the same gentle invitation again and again, to loosen, to float, to grow heavy, to grow quiet, and to follow the slow pale light, not into wakefulness, but into a softer and deeper place where dreams can begin without a sound. And now, as this sleep story continues through the soft and almost dreamlike threshold of Martian morning, let yourself drift onward above a plain where the first faint light has begun to gather in the dust, not brightly and not all at once, but with such tenderness that the land seems to welcome it the way a sleeping room welcomes a curtain slowly paling with dawn. And in this bedtime story, that first light does not call you back to wakefulness. It does the opposite, because it spreads so gently over the red world that every ridge, hollow, and ancient channel appears even calmer than before, as though Mars had spent the whole night preparing this quiet unveiling for you alone. And below you, the surface stretches outward in muted tones of rose, rust, and dim gold, a world made soft by fine dust and long memory, where ancient rivers once passed with patient grace, and where hidden ice still sleeps beneath the ground, protected by layers of soil and silence. And tonight, or rather now, in this early and restful morning, those truths are not presented as facts to hold tightly in the mind, but as textures in the atmosphere of the story, small and soothing assurances that this faraway planet has always known how to preserve what is delicate. And perhaps that is why the plain feels so comforting now, because it is both open and sheltered at once. Open beneath the enormous sky, and sheltered by the slow steadiness of time, by the dust that softens every boundary, by the coolness that lingers in the ground, and by the quiet traces of water that remain folded into the shape of the land like lines in a well-loved blanket. And as you glide lower in imagination, still weightless and calm, you may begin to sense the subtle grace of frost-touched ground, where the night's cold has lingered longest, where shallow depressions and shaded edges hold a little more coolness than the open flats, and where the landscape seems to breathe in a slower rhythm, keeping its calm even as morning arrives, because on Mars the coming of light need not mean the end of peace. It can simply mean a gentler kind of peace, a peace made visible, and in this relaxing story to fall asleep to. That visible peace becomes your companion, the dust below lying like velvet over stone, the ancient river plain curving in low, patient lines, the hidden memory of ice resting beneath it all, and every element of the scene seeming to agree that nothing urgent will happen here, nothing loud, nothing demanding, only the steady continuation of stillness as light slowly touches one old surface after another, and perhaps somewhere far across the plain, a shallow ridge catches the earliest warmth, while a nearby hollow remains cool and dim, and that delicate contrast feels like the softest kind of balance, warmth beside cold, dust above ice, morning above memory. And in that balance, the mind finds it easier to let go, because nothing is sharply divided and nothing insists on being fully known. Everything is allowed to remain slightly veiled, slightly distant, and therefore perfectly suited to deep rest. And now, let your thoughts move as slowly as the scene itself, not leaping, not gathering, only drifting, the way fine red grains might drift across the surface under the lightest possible breeze, settling again almost immediately, leaving no disturbance behind. And if a final thread of wakefulness still lingers, let it become one more small thing that settles into the Martian dust, covered gently, held kindly, and released from the need to continue. And overhead, the sky grows more delicate with each passing moment. And yet the world below remains dreamlike, because the old channels of vanished rivers still hold shadow. The buried ice still keeps its silent coolness, and the broad plain still seems wrapped in the hush of night, even as the first pale color touches its edges. And this is one of the sweetest images Mars can offer in a gentle bedtime journey, a planet where dawn arrives without hurry, and where the memory of darkness stays soft around the land like a final blanket. And perhaps long ago, in another age of Mars, water may have spread across some version of this plain, gathering in low places, threading itself through channels, pausing in quiet basins before receding into history. And now all that remains is shape, texture, mineral whisper, and the patient arrangement of dust above old sediments. But for the purpose of sleep, that is more than enough, because what matters is not the precise detail, but the feeling of ancient gentleness preserved, of movement long completed, of a world that has turned its old stories into restfulness. And so remain here above the frosted plain of early Martian morning, where the light is pale, the dust is soft, the ice is hidden, and the rivers are remembered only in the calm grammar of the ground. And and let the whole scene become simpler and softer as you listen, until the red-gold horizon blurs into quiet color. The old channels fade into tenderness, and the narration itself becomes no more than a distant warmth in the cool air, guiding you farther from thought and farther into comfort, where breath is slow, limbs are heavy, and the mind no longer needs to travel anywhere at all. And in that final softening, Mars becomes less a place and more a feeling. The feeling of dust settling over time, of ice waiting beneath the surface, of ancient rivers at peace within the land, and of morning arriving so gently that sleep can continue through it, unbroken and deep, until even this sleep story fades into silence, and you are carried onward by nothing more than stillness. Stillness above the red plain, stillness beneath the pale dawn, and stillness within you at last. And now, as this sleep story continues through the soft rose hush of Martian morning, let yourself drift onward from the frost-touched plain toward a field of low and patient dunes, where the land has been shaped not by haste, but by the lightest and most enduring touch, where dust and sand have gathered into long curved forms that seem less like barriers and more like blankets softly folded by invisible hands. And in this bedtime story, the dunes are not restless things at all, but sleeping shapes upon a sleeping world, resting under a pale sky that has only just begun to brighten and still carries something of the night within it. And perhaps that is one of the most calming ways to think of Mars, as a place where even motion leaves behind stillness, where the wind may once have moved over the surface with delicate persistence, lifting fine grains and guiding them grain by grain into ripples, ridges, and smooth crescent lines, and where all that movement has now become quiet form, preserved in the open air with such tenderness that you can almost feel the calm radiating from the land below. And as you float lower over this dune field, weightless and unhurried, you may notice how each ridge curves with a gentle elegance, how the slopes lie in alternating bands of light and shadow, and how the fine reddish material seems to hold the morning glow without reflecting it too brightly, as though Mars prefers its beauty softened, filtered, and hushed, never sharp enough to wake the sleeping mind, only soft enough to guide it farther inward toward rest, and in this relaxing story to fall asleep to. The dunes become a lullaby of repetition, one long curve after another, one quiet rise after another, one tender hollow after another. And there is such peace in that repeating pattern, because the mind no longer has to search for novelty or meaning. It can simply follow the rhythm of the land, letting each dune lead gently into the next, the way one slow breath leads into another. And beneath the surface of this graceful terrain there may still be older layers, older dusts, older sediments, perhaps even the hidden memory of colder times when frost lingered more deeply, or when ice slept nearer the ground. And that thought, too, is soothing, because on Mars, the visible surface is almost never the whole story. And yet, the hidden parts do not press upward, demanding attention. They rest quietly below, content to remain covered, content to be part of the planet's inward calm. And perhaps long ago, in ages when the climate shifted and the atmosphere behaved differently, These plains gathered material in other ways, and the winds traced their patient signatures across the open ground over spans of time too large to feel. But tonight, or this early morning, in our gentle bedtime drift, none of that history needs to be grasped too tightly, because it arrives only as a feeling of long patience, a feeling of natural softness, a feeling that even the science of Mars can be as quiet as a blanket being drawn a little higher in the cool hours before waking. And now imagine the spaces between the dunes, the shallow corridors of red gold dust where shadows still rest, and the chill of night lingers a little longer. And let those cooler hollows become places where your thoughts may settle, one by one, as lightly as fine grains falling into stillness, each thought finding its own small resting place, each concern smoothing out, each leftover piece of the day becoming less defined and more distant, until it is simply part of the quiet landscape and not something you need to carry anymore. And overhead, the sky remains pale and spacious. And though morning has come to Mars in the gentlest possible way, the world is still profoundly drowsy, because the dunes hold shadow on one side and soft light on the other, because the buried cold remains beneath the ground, and because the ancient rivers, dry lakebeds, deltas, and plains we have crossed all through the long night seem to continue here in spirit, transformed now into simpler forms, into curves and hush and repeating calm. And this is why the dune field feels like a natural place for the story to linger, because dunes understand repetition, and repetition is one of the oldest comforts there is. The repetition of breathing, the repetition of waves, the repetition of footsteps that have already gone home. And here on Mars, that rhythm becomes even gentler. The same red tones, the same low shapes, the same slow widening of light, all of it inviting your body to grow heavier, while your thoughts grow lighter. And if a faint Martian breeze passes over the crest of one dune now, let it be no more than a whisper, just enough to suggest the tiniest shift of grains along the ridge, just enough to remind you that the planet is still alive in its own quiet way, not with noise or urgency, but with small, patient changes that never break the spell of rest. And perhaps somewhere beyond these dunes, there are plains that once held water, channels that once guided rivers, and slopes that still keep hidden frost in their shaded folds. But from here, they feel folded into the same grand softness, part of one vast serene world made of dust, ice, memory, and time. And as that world continues turning under its pale morning sky, it asks nothing of you at all except surrender to its pace. And so let the dunes below become simpler and simpler now, until they are only waves of red stillness, only quiet curves in a peaceful light, only the soft outer expression of a planet that has spent ages learning how to settle. And let this sleep story drift with you above them, until the words begin to thin like mist, until the shapes blur into comfort, until the whole Martian morning becomes a cradle of repeating calm in which you may rest completely, breathe slowly, and slide almost invisibly into deeper and deeper sleep. As this sleep story continues across the serene and slowly brightening face of Mars, let yourself drift onward from the gentle dunes toward a line of pale cliffs rising softly from the red ground, where the morning light touches stone with such delicacy that every edge appears softened rather than sharpened, and where this bedtime story becomes quieter still, because cliffs at this hour do not feel towering or severe. They feel sheltering, like long folds of ancient fabric lifted slightly above the plain, keeping within them the patient memory of dust, ice, and rivers that moved long ago and now rest in silence beneath the calm of the Martian sky. And as you float closer in imagination, still weightless and unhurried, you may notice the layered faces of the rock, the faint bands of rust, rose, umber, and pale gold resting one above another, with the untroubled grace of pages laid flat in a closed and sleeping book. And there is such comfort in these layers, because they remind the mind that time does not always rush, that change can arrive in the gentlest increments, one settling season after another, one quiet age leaning softly upon the next, until an entire landscape becomes a record of patience. And in this relaxing story to fall asleep to, the cliffs are not asking to be studied in detail, only to be felt as part of the larger calm, as surfaces that once knew wind and cold, and perhaps the touch of ancient water, and now stand in perfect stillness above a smoother floor, where fine dust has gathered in low drifts and shallow curves, as though the planet has spent the whole night arranging this place into a gentler and gentler shape for you to rest beside. And perhaps somewhere at the base of the cliffs, there are slopes where frost once lingered in shadow, or shallow hollows where colder material remained beneath the surface a little longer than elsewhere. And that quiet possibility makes the scene even softer, because Mars so often keeps its calmest secrets in half-light and beneath coverings, hidden ice below dust, hidden histories below stone, hidden river memories below the open plain, and all of it held with such restraint that nothing ever feels loud or urgent, only deeply preserved. And now the morning has advanced just enough to touch the upper ledges with a dim, rosy glow, while the lower reaches still hold the cool blue-gray hush of night. And this meeting of light and shadow feels almost like the meeting of waking and sleep, not a sharp boundary, but a slow blending, a place where one state eases into another with kindness. And if you are growing heavier as you listen, then let those shadowed ledges below become the place where your final waking thoughts may rest, tucked in gently, covered by calm, and asked to do nothing more. And perhaps long ago, in a different age of Mars, water moved through nearby channels or spread into basins not far from here, leaving behind fine sediments that later hardened into quiet layers. And though those waters are gone, the shape of their gentleness may still be folded into the rock, into the slope, into the arrangement of dust at the cliff's foot. And for tonight, that is more than enough, because this nighttime story does not need to prove anything. It only needs to offer the soothing idea that even motion can leave behind peace. Even a river can become rest. Even a world of science can become a cradle. And overhead, the sky continues its pale and careful turning, never bright enough to disturb the spell, while below the plain remains open and spacious, interrupted only by these protective walls of stone. and by the occasional low ridge where dust has settled as softly as powder on velvet. And the more you drift above this place, the more the whole landscape seems to move by not moving at all, turning only with the planet, breathing only through the long rhythm of light and cold, as though Mars itself has mastered the art of remaining calm while time passes through it. And if a small breeze traces the cliffside now, let it be only the faintest whisper, a touch so light that it lifts no more than a thin veil of red grains before setting them down again. And even that tiny motion seems designed not to wake the world, but to soothe it further, like a hand smoothing the corner of a blanket, already perfectly arranged. And because this sleep story is meant to carry you toward deep sleep, every detail may now become simpler and more tender. The bands of stone less distinct, the plain below more velvety, the hidden cold beneath the ground more gentle, the memory of rivers more distant and dreamlike, until the cliffs themselves feel less like rock and more like a quiet thought held at the edge of sleep. And in that softened state, Mars becomes one continuous peaceful place. Dunes behind you, plains around you, buried ice below, ancient waters remembered only through shape and texture, and these pale cliffs ahead, catching the first patient light of morning without ever surrendering their hush. And as you continue drifting along them, your body may grow warmer and heavier, even while the imagined air remains cool. Your breathing may lengthen into a slower tide, and your mind may finally stop reaching outward, choosing instead to settle like fine dust against the sheltered base of stone, and so remain here a little longer beside the pale cliffs of quiet morning, where time is layered, where old water sleeps in memory, where dust softens every surface it touches, and where the red planet turns so gently beneath the sky that this calming narration can almost disappear into it, becoming only a low and distant murmur, a soft companion at the edge of dream, until even that murmur fades, and all that remains is the peaceful image of Mars holding its cliffs, its shadows, its dust, and its ancient stillness in one long, slow, and beautiful breath. And now, as this sleep story continues through the softly unfolding calm of Martian morning, let yourself drift onward from the pale cliffs into a sheltered basin, where the land gathers itself into lower, gentler shapes, as if the red planet had made a quiet place within itself for silence to settle more deeply. And in this bedtime story, that basin feels almost like a bowl of stillness, smooth at its center, softly ridged at its edges, touched by morning light so faint and delicate that nothing seems fully awake, not the dust, not the stone, not even the sky, and certainly not the part of your mind that is already leaning toward dream. Below you, the surface seems brushed with the finest red powder, spread across old sediments and subtle curves in such a tender way that every line of the basin appears softened. And perhaps this is one of the most relaxing facts about Mars to fall asleep to, that so much of its beauty comes from what has settled, from dust that has drifted and come to rest, from ice that has hidden itself beneath the ground, from rivers that once moved and then left behind only their quiet pathways. And now all of those histories lie together in the same peaceful landscape, never arguing, never rushing, only resting side by side beneath the pale morning sky. And as you float lower, still weightless and unhurried, you may imagine the basin floor as a place where ancient materials gathered over long spans of time. Fine grains, soft sediments, hints of mineral memory, and perhaps somewhere below the visible surface, there lingers a reserve of buried cold, a hidden trace of water ice sleeping under the dust the way a cool stone sleeps beneath warm sand. And that idea is so calming because it turns the planet into a layered comfort, red warmth above, secret coolness below, open sky overhead, and everywhere a sense that nothing here has to prove itself in order to be beautiful. And in this relaxing story, to guide you toward deep sleep, the basin becomes a gentle pause in the journey, a place where movement grows even slower, where the mind no longer wants to travel far, and where every feature of the land seems designed to encourage softness. The curved edges of the hollow, the faint slope of the ground, the long shadow resting near one side, the dust lying in smooth veils over the older rock beneath it, all of it arranged with such quiet patience that it feels as if Mars itself understands the art of a gentle bedtime better than almost any world could. Perhaps long ago this basin collected something more than dust. Perhaps frost lingered here in colder seasons. Perhaps melt or moisture in some distant Martian age touched the surface and then withdrew, leaving only a subtle chemical memory in the soil. And though those possibilities belong to science, tonight they belong even more to comfort, because they remind you that Mars has always been a world of slow preservation, a world where delicate things can remain tucked away for ages, protected by silence and dryness and time. And overhead, the sky continues its patient brightening, but only just, never enough to disturb the dreamy hush of the scene. And the morning light reaches the basin in soft layers, touching one rim first and then another, leaving the middle still cool and faintly shadowed, so that the whole place seems suspended between night and day, between memory and presence, between the last deep stillness and the first almost invisible stirring of light. And as this nighttime story becomes even gentler, let your breathing follow the shape of the basin itself, a slow descent inward, a long and easy pause, a softer rise again. And with each breath, imagine your thoughts settling the way Martian dust settles, lightly, evenly, with no effort at all, until every lingering concern becomes no more than a fine grain drifting downward through calm air, and finding a quiet resting place on the floor of the mind. And perhaps along the edges of the basin, there are low patterns where wind once traced the dust into delicate ripples. And perhaps those ripples remain just visible under the soft light, not as signs of activity now, but as the afterimage of patient motion, the kind of motion that never breaks peace, only creates it. And this is one of the loveliest qualities of Mars in a calming narration like this, that even its winds seem to work in whispers, even its changes arrive with grace, and even its oldest stories are told not with sound, but with shape. Beneath the dust there may be compacted layers from older ages, perhaps sediments laid down when water still moved through nearby plains, perhaps the faint remains of a world less dry than the one we see now. And yet none of that feels distant or sad tonight, because on Mars the past is not lost. It is simply resting, folded into the land, preserved beneath the red, held in the same stillness that now holds you. And now the basin becomes simpler with every moment, not less beautiful, only softer. The edges blur a little. The colors quiet themselves into rose, umber, and muted gold. The hidden ice below becomes only coolness. The ancient rivers become only memory. The dust becomes only comfort. And the whole red world seems to lower its voice until this sleep story is almost indistinguishable from the rhythm of your own slow breathing. And so remain here above the sheltered basin a little longer, floating without effort above a place shaped by time, softened by dust, and guarded by silence, where every layer of the planet seems to whisper the same gentle invitation to loosen, to settle, to become heavy, to become still, and to let the peaceful science of Mars, its dust, its ice, its ancient river memory, and its long morning hush, carry you quietly and completely toward deep sleep. And now, as this sleep story continues through the softly brightening hush of Mars, let yourself drift onward from the sheltered basin toward a long and gentle ridge that rises only slightly above the surrounding plain, a place where the land seems to lift its head just enough to watch the quiet morning arrive. And in this bedtime story, that ridge does not feel exposed or lonely, but calm and watchful, as though it has spent ages resting between dust and sky, holding within its layered body the memory of colder seasons, hidden frost, and perhaps the far-off nearness of water that once moved nearby with exquisite patience. Below you, the surface is still softened by fine red dust, spread like powdered velvet across stone and sediment, and the light of morning remains pale enough that every detail is wrapped in kindness, the low crest of the ridge glowing faintly, while its shaded side keeps a trace of the coolness left behind by night. And there is something deeply soothing in that balance. Warmth on one side, chill on the other, dust above, secret stillness below, all of it resting together without conflict. All of it perfectly suited to a relaxing story meant to help you fall asleep. And perhaps this is one of the gentlest facts about Mars to rest beside, that the planet holds so many places where ancient climate remains quietly written into the ground, where ridges, slopes, and sheltered faces preserve the effects of frost, wind, and old water-shaped change, not in loud display, but in tender form. And as you float along the ridge in this calming narration, you do not need to interpret those forms too sharply, only to feel how patiently they were made, how slowly they were softened, how beautifully they now belong to the greater stillness of the world. And maybe somewhere beneath the dust, along this gentle rise, there is buried ice resting in thin, hidden layers, protected from the morning by soil and shade. And if you imagine that coolness beneath the surface, the whole ridge begins to feel like a quiet promise, a reminder that on Mars, the most delicate things are often preserved by being covered, by being sheltered, by being allowed to remain unseen beneath a red blanket of time. And in this nighttime story, which has now drifted so gently into morning that the two feel almost the same. That hidden ice becomes less a scientific detail and more a comforting image, a soft blue-white memory sleeping under rust-colored dust, a reserve of calm beneath the visible world, like a deeper level of rest beneath your final waking thoughts. And as the ridge extends before you in a slow and graceful line, you may notice how the wind, over ages, has brushed its crest into smoother curves, how dust has collected in its shallower folds, and how the ground on either side opens into wide expanses where ancient channels may once have wandered in quieter ages, leaving behind paths now nearly softened into the plain. And that thought is restful too, because it means the ridge is not alone. It belongs to a larger sleeping geography of rivers remembered, basins preserved, ice hidden, and dust endlessly settling. And overhead, the sky has lightened a little more. Yet nothing about the world below feels alert, only luminous in a sleepy way, as if the morning itself had chosen to whisper rather than speak. And this makes the ridge feel even gentler, its long line running through the landscape like a sentence from an old lullaby, simple, unhurried, and almost too soft to fully hear. And perhaps long ago, water paused near places like this, gathering at lower edges, passing through shallow depressions, leaving sediments that later dried, cooled, and rested under the care of the Martian air. And though those waters are gone now, the rhythm of their passing remains folded into the shape of the land. And for the purpose of sleep that is enough, more than enough, because the story of Mars is not only a story of what was there, but of what stayed afterward, the quiet after movement, the rest after flow, the tenderness after time. And now let your breathing follow the line of the ridge, long and slow, rising gently with the crest and descending softly along the far side, until each breath feels like a peaceful crossing over the red ground. And with each crossing, your thoughts become lighter and fewer, the way loose grains become still after the faintest breeze has passed. And if one small thought remains wakeful, let it settle into the shaded side of the ridge where the cold lingers longest. Let it rest there beneath dust and silence, held without effort, preserved without pressure, until it no longer feels like a thought at all, but only part of the landscape, part of the same calm arrangement of slope, sediment, and hidden coolness. And because this sleep story is meant to carry you gently toward deep sleep, every detail may soften now, the crest less defined, the dust more velvety, the buried ice more dreamlike, the old traces of water more distant and tender, until Mars itself becomes a single continuous feeling of hush, a world where nothing is lost so much as settled, where even ancient rivers remain as softness in the land, and where every ridge, basin, plain, and dune seems to know how to keep stillness safe. And so drift a little farther along this quiet ridge, where ancient waters slept nearby and hidden ice may still sleep below, while the pale morning glows without urgency and the red planet turns in perfect calm beneath you. And let the whole scene become simpler, slower, and kinder with every breath, until this bedtime story is only a low and comforting murmur. This gentle bedtime is only a rhythm of drifting light over dust, and you are carried onward effortlessly and completely into that deeper silence where rest becomes dream, and dream becomes deep sleep. And now, as this sleep story reaches its final and gentlest chapter, let yourself drift without effort across the peaceful face of Mars one last time, not as a traveler hurrying anywhere, not as a watcher seeking answers, but simply as a quiet presence moving through a world of dust, ice, and ancient rivers that has given all of its calm to you through the long unfolding hush of this bedtime story. And as you glide onward in this final nighttime story, the whole red planet seems softer than ever, its dunes lower, its ridges gentler, its old lakebed smoother, its pale cliffs dimmer in the tender morning light, until every place we have crossed together begins to blend into one wide and weightless feeling of rest. And perhaps that is the deepest comfort Mars can offer in a relaxing story like this, that a world so distant can feel so soothing, so untroubled, so patient in its quiet preservation, holding beneath its dust the cool memory of hidden ice, carrying in the shape of its valleys the lingering grace of ancient rivers, and keeping in its basins and plains the peaceful record of water that once moved and then slowly, lovingly came to rest. And now, with each slow breath, let the details become less important than the stillness they create, because you no longer need to picture each crater, each delta, each frost-touched hollow exactly. You only need to feel the softness of the whole planet around you, the red gold hush of its surface, the thin and silent air above it, the old sediments resting below, and the immense kindness of a landscape that asks nothing from you except that you grow heavier, quieter, and more willing to drift. And if any thought remains awake, let it float lightly above the Martian plain for a moment, then descend as gently as fine dust descending through calm air, settling into the surface without a sound, becoming part of the red stillness instead of something separate from it. Because this gentle bedtime was never meant to hold you in thought, only to carry you past thought into that soft and drowsy place where language loosens, and where the mind no longer reaches outward, and perhaps far below, under a tender covering of dust, the ancient ice still sleeps in shaded ground, cool and undisturbed, while elsewhere the faint lines of old riverbeds still curve through the land with the grace of something once fluid and now forever peaceful. And above it all, the morning remains pale and quiet, not bright enough to wake, only soft enough to reveal how beautifully Mars has learned to keep its secrets in silence. And as this calming narration grows lower and slower, let the planet beneath you become simpler and simpler, until it is only a gentle sphere of rose-red quiet turning in the dark of space, crowned with frost, folded with old canyons, traced with vanished waters, and softened everywhere by the patient settling of dust. And in that simplicity, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to remember, nothing left to do except rest. And because this has been a sleep story made to help you fall asleep, let its final images arrive like the last ripples on a lake that has already gone still. A dune holding shadow on one side and pale light on the other, a silent basin where sediment has slept for ages, a hidden sheet of ice beneath red soil, a winding dry channel where ancient water once passed gently by, But even those images blur, soften, and recede the way dreams begin before you notice that they have begun. And now imagine that Mars itself is growing more distant, not in a lonely way, but in a tender way, as if the planet understands that it has carried you far enough and is now releasing you into a deeper quiet, letting the red horizon fade, letting the dust soften into color alone, letting the cliffs and plains dissolve into one velvety hush, until there is only the feeling of floating, only the rhythm of breathing, only the slow and gentle permission to let go. And if the words are still reaching you, let them become lighter than before, lighter than dust, lighter than frost, lighter than the memory of water, so light that they no longer ask to be followed from beginning to end, but only felt as a warmth beside you, a distant murmur at the edge of sleep, a voice dimming with great care, so that nothing sharp remains. And perhaps that is the truest ending for this bedtime story. Not a conclusion, not a farewell in any waking sense, but a fading, a soft receding into the same stillness that Mars has been offering all along. The stillness of buried ice, the stillness of dry lake beds, the stillness of ancient rivers preserved only in shape, the stillness of red dust settling over everything that once moved, until motion becomes memory and memory becomes peace. And so let yourself sink a little deeper now, beneath the last pale color of morning, beneath the final whisper of this relaxing story, beneath even the thought of Mars itself, and rest in the quiet that remains when all journeys have softened, when all landscapes have blurred into comfort, when all facts have turned into lullaby, and when the whole sleeping red world has become no more than a cradle of silence, holding you gently, steadily, and without end, while this voice fades lower and lower and softer still, until it becomes almost nothing, and then less than nothing, and then only the slow, warm hush in which you finally, peacefully, completely, deeply fall asleep.